Hey everybody, Kanad here from ReadMe. Today we're going to go over a couple of integrations that we've been building in partnership with AWS. The first integration will help you take changes that you make to your API and Amazon API Gateway and deploy them to your API reference section in ReadMe. And the second integration goes over the personalized docs webhook, which allows you to surface custom user information such as API keys and server variables for your users in their docs. And we'll talk about how you can deploy the personalized docs webhook using AWS Lambda. But before we get into the integrations, let's talk about what ReadMe is. With ReadMe, you can build a beautiful developer hub for your users to be successful with your API. At ReadMe, we believe a great developer hub and a great developer experience encompasses a bunch of different things. For example, the standards project education that you see in a lot of documentation products, such as product guides, and we have something called recipes, which are interactive, use case-driven code walkthroughs. We also think that having a real-time API playground where you can actually make requests without leaving the docs is a great way to get folks to that first call even faster. And if you set up the personalized docs webhook, which we'll talk about later in the session, you can really go above and beyond in helping your users get to that first call because you can actually surface, for example, their API keys directly in the docs, which allows them to try it and immediately run an authenticated request. The last thing I'll talk about are developer metrics, which allow you to see which pages in your developer hub are the most popular, see if folks are able to make successful calls with your API. As you can see, this is very empty right now because this is a brand new project. But yeah, this is a great way to understand how folks are performing with your API, how folks are using your developer hub to be successful. So let's dive into the setup process for this Amazon API Gateway integration. So there are a few prerequisites that we'll need to get started, which I'll show here. So the first one is you're going to want to have a ReadMe project up and running. You're going to want to have your Amazon API Gateway ready to go. You're going to want to have an access key set up. That's created through the Identity and Access Management dashboard. And then lastly, you're going to want to install the AWS and the AWS SAM CLIs. SAM, in this case, is Amazon's open source toolkit for deploying serverless applications to API Gateway. While this integration uses AWS SAM to deploy this code to AWS, it is not required to integrate API Gateway with ReadMe more broadly. This part is pretty plug and play, so if your company uses a different toolkit, like say the serverless framework, you can follow along with your own toolkit when it's time to deploy the code to AWS. Once you have those two CLIs installed, you're going to want to load your access key into the CLI using AWS Configure. Cool, so I have added my access key, I've set up the two CLIs, and I've loaded my access key into them. So I'm going to go back to GitHub here. So I have this repository up. It's from AWS. It's called Serverless Samples. And we're going to be working inside this API Gateway ReadMe integration subdirectory. I'll link to this in the video description. What we're going to want to do is clone down this repository, and we're going to be running some commands as laid out in this ReadMe file. It also has a really good overview of the different AWS resources that we're going to be setting up here. Highly recommend checking that out if you need some background on how this integration works. But let's just dive into it. So I already have the repository cloned. What I'm going to do is populate a few values in this template.yaml file, and then we're going to be running a few commands that are listed down here. All right, so let's start populating this file. So the first value we're going to grab is the API Gateway ID. So if I go to my API Gateway, you can see the API Gateway ID is this value up here. So I'm going to pop that in to here. So the next value is the stage for this API Gateway. And this is actually a really powerful part of how this integration works. So say you have a staging pipeline and a production pipeline. You can set up different integrations for each stage. So say you want to have a staging version of your API Gateway to sync to a staging version of your docs and correspondingly with your production gateway as well. So what we're going to want to do is grab the stage name. So if you've already deployed your API, you will have created a stage already, but if not, you'll just want to go into here and click Deploy API, and that will prompt you to create a stage. But in this case, I've already created a stage. It's called production, so I'm just going to pop that value into here. Awesome. So the next value I'm going to want to populate is this README project version number, which I will get from the README dashboard, and that is this version up here, version 1.0. Again, this may vary for you depending on your versioning needs and the kind of pipeline that you have set up. That's going to be right here, v1.0. And the next thing is a README API key, and I can do that by going back into the dashboard here, going to configuration, and then API keys. I'm going to create a new API key here. I'll just call this API gateway integration. Awesome. I'm going to copy that. I'm going to paste that into here. And then lastly, the README administrative email. I'm going to pop this into here. I'm just going to say Kanad AWS at readme.io. And I believe that is everything. So I'm going to save these changes here, and then I believe we start running some commands. So if we go back to the repository, so first we're going to install some dependencies, and then we're going to run a build and then a deploy command. So let's start doing that. I'm going to pull up my terminal here. All right, the dependencies are installed. I'm going to run this sam build command. Awesome. So you can see here it created some build assets in this get ignored directory. So the next function that we're going to run is this deploy command. All right, this is the stack name. I'm just going to call this README sync demo. The AWS region, so you can confirm this. I'm just going to double check here. Where is my API gateway deployed? North Virginia, US East 1. Awesome. So that's correct. My gateway ID. So this is pulling the values from here. So I can just confirm that, confirm that. It's going to be a REST. The project version, again, that's being pulled from the template here. No API definition ID. That's correct. That's correct. Confirm changes. Everything looks good. And then, all right, so I believe we can just hit the defaults for the rest of these. Yes, yes, yes. Okay, so now it is deploying this configuration. So now we play the waiting game. All right, so the change set is this. As you can see, it's creating a bunch of different AWS resources in order to get the whole pipeline going. And we're going to say yes, deploy. All right, now it's creating the resources. So this will take a little bit of time. Great, so the stack was successfully created. So the next step is to go into our API gateway and deploy the API. And the idea is that once this API is deployed, reference docs will be automatically synced to README. So to get this going, we're going to click Actions here, and then we're going to click Deploy API, and then we're going to select the deployment stage. So in our case, it's going to be production. That was the stage that we had defined earlier. And then let's click Deploy and see how this goes. All right, the API was deployed. We're going to give it a few seconds and then check in the README dashboard to see if the API docs successfully showed up. Okay, so we're going to head to the README dashboard, and then what we're going to do is navigate to the API reference section. So we're going to refresh the page here, and we can see here that all the endpoints showed up properly. So if we go to the actual docs, are they showing up there as well? Yes, they are. Awesome. So the next thing that we're going to do is deploy a change. So you can see here that now that we actually have it up and running, as we update our API gateway, we'll also be able to update our reference docs subsequently. So let's take, for example, this pet put endpoint. Notice how I only have 400 responses here. Let's say that I want to also describe the fact that this API endpoint can also return a 200. So I'm going to go into this endpoint in API gateway. That's going to be this pet put endpoint. You can see here we have those three statuses defined. I'm going to add a 200 here and click Save. Awesome. And then I'm going to deploy this change. Production, deploy. And then we wait again for just a little bit. All right, it just showed up. And then if I refresh this endpoint, will that 200 show up? There it is. All right, so let's take a step back and think about the bigger picture here. I think there's a tremendous amount of value in being able to just make a change in API gateway, and then without even thinking about it, your users will automatically see the latest and greatest documentation to reflect that change. But what if we take this a step further and proactively provide users with their API keys so they have one less hurdle to jump through to get to that first successful call? That's where the personalized docs webhook comes in. In order to access and set up the personalized docs webhook, you'll want to go to configuration and then personalized docs here. And you can see that we have API gateway specific code samples, as you can check out here. We have a variety of different Lambda runtimes available. And what's really cool about these Lambda specific code samples is that we have the option to provision new keys for users. So anytime a new user logs into your ReadMe docs, we'll be able to provision new API gateway API keys for them, which in turn will be populated in their reference docs. So that way, when new users log in, they can immediately start making authenticated requests to your API. If you want to find out more about this, you can check out a dedicated personalized docs setup video that I made. So hope this was helpful for you. Hope that you got a good sense of what ReadMe is all about, how these integrations work. If you have any questions, be sure to hit us up, support@readme.io. Without further ado, I'll wrap it up here. Have a good day, folks.